Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'm happy to be talking to you about natural selection. And I know natural selection has been a topic of our conversation for a while, but I think today where I'm going to introduce some interesting ideas to it and sort of expand on it a little bit. We're going to talk about different types of natural selection, different interesting things that can occur as a result of it. When you look at the population in general, you can see some fascinating consequences of natural selection. And so let me jump right into that conversation and see what comes of it. So let me start off by saying that one of the most important principles to get when you're looking at a population is, like, for example, in these moths right here, there's a lot of variation that we see in any particular phenotype or trait that we're willing to consider, whether it be human iris color, or it could be skin pigmentation, it could be really any trait. There's a lot of different variations. And look at this peppered moth right here, how camouflaged it is in the lichen. So how do we get variation? Well, variation, as you may already know, occurs when there's changes in DNA. DNA contains the recipe for making proteins, and so RNA is the intermediate, and then those proteins manifest in a trait, which we consider to be a phenotype. And so how do you get those variations? Well, mutation is how that occurs. So mutation is simply a change in the DNA. So there's different kinds of mutations, but basically they're a change in the nitrogen-based sequence of a particular gene, and it results in a new allele. Now, these are rare. We have mechanisms in the cell that will correct changes or mistakes that occur. And so occasionally a rare mutation will come in, and they're random. You never know what the change will be. And so if a change is random, then the consequences or the effects of the mutation could be one of three things. It could either be a positive change, it could be no effect at all, or it could be a negative change. And so ultimately, when you change the DNA, it could be positive. And as the result of it, what determines whether or not the mutation's positive, I think that's kind of clear, whether or not the organism's able to survive better in a particular local environment. And that's how we categorize a positive mutation. But certainly this is how all new alleles arise. And so genes usually have many alleles. It's sort of like you can have a lasagna recipe, and there's a lot of variation on that. But it's basically the same general theme, but there's slightly different subtleties, like sauce and different types of cheeses, whether it be vegetarian or meat. So this is how you get new and different proteins. This is a picture of a protein. Could be an enzyme, for example. Because the DNA, when you change the DNA, you're going to ultimately change the amino acid sequence. And therefore, that's going to affect its three-dimensional shape, and you're going to get a new protein. And then the new protein manifests in a phenotypic new trait. And so this is how variation comes into being in a population. Now, let me remind you of something obvious. Charles Darwin did not know anything about DNA or mutations or how variation occurred, but he did notice it. He noticed in his principles of natural selection that populations tend to overproduce. And when they produce a lot of offspring, that's going to lead to competition over limited resources. And when there's competition over limited resources and organisms are vying for something that they really need to live, the variation is going to lead to some organisms being a little bit better than others, for whatever the reason being. And so variation will lead to some organisms that are better suited to survive. So there's good phenotypes. And if you're surviving, you're probably going to have a greater fitness, which means you're going to have more offspring. So ultimately, in the population, there's a differential reproductive success due to the fact that there's some variants that are better suited. And so those individuals in the next generation, and in the next generation, have these traits that are well suited to a particular local environment, and then we can call that out and say, wow, that's a really, really important adaptation. So in other words, a trait that enables an organism to survive and be successful in that particular environment. Now, adaptation can be many things. It could be a behavioral type of thing. In other words, what organisms do, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. And so they could migrate, they could hibernate, they could learn. So behavior is a very important adaptation. Now, most people, I think, if you ask them, name an adaptation of a lion, they might say, well, a lion is fast, a lion is strong, a lion has claws, a lion has strong teeth. Those are all morphological, in other words, physical structures, and those are great adaptations as well, like the webbed feet of a duck, for example. So morphological adaptations, behavioral, and then there's biochemical. Things that you can't normally see, like all our enzymes or secretions or saliva or oil on our skin. All of the biochemical pathways are the result of enzymes, are the result of adaptation that was created through natural selection. And so just to sort of really drive that point home, like examples of behavioral adaptation would be like organisms adjusting what they do. In other words, when it gets different seasons, organisms have a tendency to migrate if it gets cold in a particular season. Even things like this, working in a society, sort of grooming each other, helping each other cooperatively. I would argue that our whole societal network, our hierarchy of laws that we have, a government, leadership, all of these kind of behaviors, that a police force, all these things working together are behavioral adaptations to live in a group. And then over here you have these look like wild dogs that are trying to take down this big beast right over here. They wouldn't be able to do it individually, so their behavioral adaptation is to work cooperatively. Same thing with birds that are fishing, that it's better to capture them if they form a net like this. So these are behavioral adaptations to survive. And so another type of adaptation I mentioned is morphological or structure. We talk a lot about these tortoises that live on the Galapagos Islands, and they have these really cool adaptations, the shells that sort of poke up right here that will allow the tortoise to reach up to the high cactus. And then over here in this wolf, you can see the teeth and the good sense of smell and maybe good vision and speed and agility and strength. These are all structures. But it could even be something microscopic, like for example, our red blood cells. Look at this. This is an incredible morphological adaptation. It's biconcave, so it's like sort of indented, and it's a flat cell. If you remember, this really increases, a flat cell really increases its surface area to volume ratio, and the cells are very small. So this is able to take in oxygen and release oxygen very easily just because of its structure. And then finally, the biochemical, or if you will, physiological adaptation would be just biochemical pathways. Like for example, here this is a look at photosynthesis inside the chloroplast and the different biochemical pathways that are involved in producing sugar. Or here's a secretion of a squid inking, which is a sort of a physiological biochemical reaction to help distract a predator, or even bioluminescence in a deep ocean jellyfish like this. So what I want to discuss now is what's the effects of natural selection on a population? And you're like, well, I don't know. I guess it eliminates those that don't have a good phenotype, and I guess it encourages those that do have a good phenotype. And then over generations, we should be able to see a change. Yes, that's the case. But if you were to graph this, like for example, like in a given population, if you said the number of organisms, so this is like a few organisms, many more organisms, and then this is like the peak number of organisms. If you put down over here on the x-axis a particular trait, like for example height, if you were to line up everybody in school in terms of their height, what you would see is something called a normal curve. Sometimes it's called a bell-shaped curve. If I were to draw this line like this and maybe put a little bell right here, ding, ding, ding. So it's a normal curve. You would expect to see something like this. Most individuals fall in sort of the middle range. A few individuals are shorter, and there's a few individuals, in terms of number, that are extremely high. What would happen if there's some kind of environmental change, or what happens, what does natural selection do over generations to a normal curve? This is my question. What kinds of things can happen to a bell-shaped curve over time? And so as you can see here, this is the example that I was giving in terms of height and the number of people. This is in inches. These are the number of people that exhibit this particular height. Notice it's many are sort of medium height. There's a few individuals that are very tall, a few individuals that are very short. Well, I want to introduce you to the different types of results that can occur from natural selection. Sometimes they're just simply called the types of natural selection. One's called stabilizing, another one's called directional, another one's called disruptive, and then sexual selection. And so let's jump right into that. Here's a typical example of what we were talking about, a bell-shaped curve. Here are the number of butterflies that exhibit this particular trait. And you're like, what trait is this? It could be the coloration of the wings of the butterfly. Notice purple, real dark. There's only a couple. There's only a few light ones. Most of them are sort of middle of the road. Well, stabilizing selection in this type of environment, apparently over several generations, apparently, if you can see this, the white coloration or the white morphology isn't doing well, and the purple is not doing well. So stabilizing selection encourages the middle of the road trait more, or the middle of the road phenotype or variation more. So it eliminates the extreme individuals. So individuals that are average, if you will, are successful. So that's the good phenotype. And so over time, our bell-shaped curve kind of squishes, and so it's kind of pokey. So that's one of the effects. So in other words, if I were to superimpose the above graph on it like this, dotted lines like this is what it was before, and this is what it is now. So you walk into a population, you're like, wow, it seems like there's not a lot of extremes. It seems like everybody is sort of similar to one another, and that's an example of what can occur in stabilizing selection, where the extreme phenotypes have a disadvantage. And so examples of this would be maybe just simply, there's a lot of different kinds of plants and trees, but I'll just simplify the idea. If you're a very short plant, maybe you're not doing well because you're not able to grow fast enough, or you're not able to compete for sunlight in a forest. But maybe if you grow really tall, that's not so good either, because you might grow so quickly that you haven't put enough secondary growth in, and you're easily toppled over, for example, by wind. And so most trees in the forest don't exhibit, or plants don't exhibit, any shortness or tallness, but most of them are approximately the same size. That's stabilizing. Human birth weight. Now, when you think, well, there's a little bit of a range in human birth. You can have 4 pounds, 5 pounds, 6 pounds, 7, 8, 9, 10. But the truth is, when you look at human birth weight, most babies are born around 8 pounds. It's very rare that you'll get low birth weight and extremely high birth weight. Now, I know modern medicine can keep these preemie babies alive, and if a baby is determined through ultrasound to be huge, that baby can be removed from the mother using a cesarean section and just surgically removed. But think about this. Like, for generations and generations of the past, for humans, if a baby was born very low weight, they may not survive. And if a baby was really big, that they may not survive either, by like maybe even taking the mother out during the birthing process. And so mothers that had low birth and high birth were sort of selected against. And so human birth weight is really around 8 pounds. And so I don't know if you recognize this. This is a picture of my daughter, Nora. And here she is getting her first weighing, and she was just about 8 pounds. She was 7 pounds, 11 ounces. So how about that? Stabilizing selection, close to home. And then this is something called directional selection. You might be familiar with this one. Like, for example, if you start off with the bell-shaped curve, And depending on what the environment is, now look at this. If the environment is changing and over many generations, you start to see a lot more of the purple ones. Now, why a lot more of the purple ones and the dark blue ones? It must mean that these lighter color ones are dying. That's what it means. It's like they're not changing colors. These ones are being selected against. Maybe the predator is picking these off, and these are more camouflaged, and therefore these ones are living, and then therefore they're reproducing, and therefore there's a lot more. So what's happening is the curve is moving in this particular direction. So this is the start, and this is what it looks like after time. It doesn't have to be purple. It could even go in this other direction. But it's called directional because it moves to an extreme. One extreme does really well, or the other extreme does really well. And so the middle of the road and also the other extreme has a disadvantage. And so examples here, like for example, this is kind of funny, but an anteater, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it has this big long snout, and it has a tongue that comes out that can go into these ant holes, and it can, or these ant mounds, and it can actually, suck up these ants, and they stick to the tongue. But as it turns out, the ants are sort of hip to this, and so they'll be building like deeper and deeper nests. And so if you have a really short tongue, if you're an anteater with a very, very short tongue variation, you're not going to do very well. So as it turns out, there's a selective pressure for directional selection for anteaters pretty much to have a long tongue. And the same thing could be said about giraffes as well. The long neck is encouraged. That's an example of that. Now, peppered moths, you're familiar with this. Like for example, there's not a lot of different variations, but if you have dark and you have light and there's an environmental change to a dark environment, what you're going to see over several generations is that this white one right here, the peppered one, becomes very conspicuous in this new environment. So it gets eaten, and so these dark ones start reproducing, and so there's a directional selection towards the dark morphology. And so that's a great classic, if you will. Textbook example of directional selection is the peppered moth. And then I like this one. It's one of my favorites. It's called Disruptive. And so you're like, well, if it's not middle of the road, and if it's not one extreme or the other extreme, what else is there? Well, how do you like this? How about if the intermediate phenotype is discouraged, but both extremes are encouraged? In other words, it's good to be dark, it's good to be light. That's a little weird. Like, what would be an example of that? Middle of the road isn't doing well, and the extremes are looking good. Well, there's a great example of this in finches. Finches are not just found on the Galapagos Islands, but they're found in Africa as well. And so in this area of West Africa, there's some finches that live there, and there's hardly any intermediates. So when you look at these populations, you see birds that have these really large beaks and ones with really small, and you don't see hardly any intermediates. So it's kind of like these two mountains with a valley, like a watershed. And you're like, well, what's up with that? Well, it's related to what they're eating. It's like the large ones are more efficient at hard seeds, and the smaller billed beaks are more efficient at the soft seeds. And so apparently if you're intermediate, you can't handle these really small ones, and then you're not strong enough to handle the larger, harder seeds. And so you can't go one way or the other, and so the intermediate is discouraged. It's very strange. It would be like in a population like in San Francisco, if almost everyone was very short and everyone was very tall in the population, and the intermediate was discouraged. In a later video, I'm going to talk to you about disruptive selection when it comes to mating seasons. Sometimes organisms will breed early, and then they won't breed in the middle, and they'll breed later in a season, and therefore avoiding competition. And you get an example of disruptive selection. And so the final type of effect of natural selection is something called sexual. Now, sexual meaning, like, can you tell just by looking at this picture which lion is the male lion and which is the female lion? I think you might be able to. The male is a little bit larger, it has the mane, that kind of thing. And so why is that? Why is there a difference in physical morphology between males and females. You ever wondered that? Like, there's differences of appearance. This is called sexual selection. What's it all about? Well, as it turns out, selection, natural selection is what we're talking about, favors males. Like, for example, another classic example is the male peacock. It's bright plumage. Look at the feathers. Look at the tail. Look at this, how ornate it is. And so what it's all about, and I think you may know this, is that the male uses its beautiful coloration to attract a mate. Now, the female, on the other hand, so there's a selection towards most beautiful, larger, more conspicuous, more showing, more attractive, and you can get more mates. So that's the selection pressure. Now, female is maybe just the opposite. There's a selection to become really drab, in other words, not conspicuous, not showy. Now, why is that? Maybe the female, you don't want to be showy, because why would you want to be if you're the one choosing the mate? And also, if you're raising offspring, maybe it's not so good if you have bright coloration and are showy, because you might attract a predator to the children. And so there's differences between males and females in terms of phenotypes, and what we call that is sexual dimorphism. In other words, there's two morphologies. There's a bright one and a drab one. So it's dimorphism, sexual dimorphism. There's many examples of this. You might be familiar with this on the Galapagos Island. The male frigate bird has this a sort of red pouch that it's able to inflate with air, and then it also employs behavioral adaptations in a courtship ritual. It sort of falls on its back and sort of waddles around. But the females, this is clearly a male bird. Look at this, how conspicuous it is and showy. So the females circle around and they pick the males that have this beautiful red pouch. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, what's the point of it all? Well, if you're female and you're choosing a mate, you might want to choose somebody who's very strong and very muscular and very fit, because that might be a good parent for your offspring. And so that's something that you're looking for in a mate. And so females are generally the ones that choose their mates. And males are generally larger in size, and then they compete. They're also very colorful. So these are the ways in which they're different than females. And they're showy for the most part. But here's my final question. It's like, does this really help them survive? Now, I know it helps them attract a mate, but does it really help them survive? I might argue that it's a pretty scary disadvantage to be conspicuous. It's not maybe a great idea to be, if you're a peacock, to have such a massive tail like that. If a predator's coming, you're going to be in big trouble. And so, as it turns out, this sort of solves one of the philosophical questions that we have in biology. What's more important, to survive or to reproduce? And I think the answer may be coming up right here. I think it's more important to reproduce. The males are willing to extend themselves into danger to be conspicuous, to show off, and to attract attention, which is putting them in harm's way. But it doesn't matter. The ultimate goal is I've got to find a mate and I've got to have children. And so I think ultimately that answers the why question, why males are more showy than females. So those are some examples. There's many more. You might want to look them up and investigate this. So the different types of natural selection. So I hope you enjoyed that this video. Thanks for watching.